This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working. And at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. So begins George Orwell's infamous novel 1984, perhaps one of the most influential texts of the 20th century, which depicts the perfect totalitarian society. Now, for those who aren't familiar with it, the novel tells the story of Winston Smith, an average man crushed by living in the perfected totalitarian society, a world where a political party not only has established control over politics, as one might expect, but they actually control the minds of their citizens. Now, how does the party do this? It does it through basically a variety of tactics. There's obviously constant surveillance by the party, highlighted by the posters that I just read about. Right? The idea of Big Brother is always watching you. There is no space that the party is not looking at. Now, the party also encouraged vigilance in all of its members, so that the slightest error, deviation, or critical comment could result in your arrest. There was no space left for the individual, the private, even the concept of relaxation, right? The party in 1984 does not want to allow you the mental space to think about anything outside of the terms that they have dictated. To reinforce all this, the party also created these performative rituals, such as Hate Week, where everyone would get together and start shouting at screens that were playing pictures of the enemy, encouraging anger, and reinforcing perceptions of injustice and threat. These threats then served as an excuse for the extraordinary measures that the party had taken, including all the surveillance, right? When it's wartime, we generally tend to err on the side of allowing more surveillance, more invasion, more taking away of our rights than we do during sort of quote-unquote normal times. But perhaps the scariest and most influential element of the book is the way that the party forces people to change perceptions of their own reality. There is no such thing as truth as we would know it in Orwell's 1984. Or rather, one could say that truth is entirely subjective, not a reflection of reality, but simply the belief in what the party has told you to believe. To use a popular expression from the book, 2 plus 2 actually equals 5 because the party has told you that it does. Or as Orwell actually wrote in the book, quote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command," end quote. Now, think about this for a second. I know this is a science fiction novel. I know it's not real. But how do you get people to ignore reality? How can you convince someone that 2 plus 2 equals 5 when they can literally count on their hand and see that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Now, in the book, the way the party does this is varied. Right? Of course, they control all the media. But controlling media does not equate to controlling minds. long history of structures, governments, right, where they have control of the media, they have censorship, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can enforce the idea of belief on the entire population. So how do they do it? Well, again, in 1984, part of the secret isn't just that they control the means of producing the information, but they actually control and they actually strictly maintain the idea of language. They force people to repeat lies again and again and again until they become accepted as truth. And these lies are not just the sort of old-fashioned, ordinary political lies that one might expect, right? The idea that, hey, the party is great, the economy is doing well, we are the best. Right? All political parties try to make those claims to varying degrees, right? There's some degree of truth, maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. No party goes out and says, hey, we suck, vote for us. Right? They're always kind of trying to frame things. But in 1984, the key thing is not just making you say, oh, the party is great, we love the party, we love the politicians. The key thing is getting you to believe in logical contradictions. Ideas where it can't be one and the other at the same time. You cannot have war and peace at the same time. And yet in 1984, they love this slogan, war is peace. Another one that they like to say, freedom. We love freedom, right? What is freedom in 1984? Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Right? The best way to be smart is to not know anything and to let others think for you. The best way to be free is to emancipate yourself from having to make your own decisions and let others, in this case the party, make that decision for you. We know in reality that these things cannot be true. But the party drives it home again and again and again until people believe it. Because once it has achieved this level of influence, you are essentially admitting that it creates reality. That true reality as we know it, the idea that there's a wall in front of me, that I can walk into that wall, that I can hit my head, that doesn't exist in 1984 because the party can create reality. If it tells me there's no wall there, even if I physically run into it, I can make my brain come up with some other excuse to say, there is no wall. I decided to stop, there was wind, who knows? All of this, of course, is incredibly disturbing. Because once the party has control over your thoughts, over your perceptions of reality, then there can be no resistance. Even the harshest dictatorships, the most ruthless governments, they can be resisted. But you cannot fight against your own mind. This then is where the ultimate power and the ultimate sort of fear and anxiety caused by 1984. This is why it is such a scary book to read, because if we cannot control our own thoughts, then we have no free will, then we have become slaves, and there is no hope for emancipation from it. Okay, why spend so much time on Orwell in 1984 when this podcast is actually going to be about Joseph Stalin? The answer, of course, is that 1984 is based in part on Soviet society. Orwell actually admitted in an interview, after he had published it, of course, that the idea behind the book was to imagine what a Stalinist model would look like if it was applied to Britain in the 1940s. And there are plenty of direct examples that drive this kind of idea of a connection home. Like the party in 1984, the Soviets constantly revised their history to fit with contemporary trends or directions. For example, there are very few Russians or pro-Soviet sort of people out there who remember that from 1939 to 1941, the Soviet Union was actively allied with Nazi Germany. If you go to Russia today, if you talk to Russians about World War II, it is wall-to-wall coverage of the great sacrifices that the Soviet people made, not just to liberate their own country, but to protect the people of Eastern Europe. Right? If you look at some of the statements made by the Russian government during this war with Ukraine, they seem incredulous that the Poles wouldn't support them. They're, we freed you Poles, right? We drove the Nazis out. They have totally erased from their minds the idea that, well, from 1939 to 1941, the Soviet Union actually invaded the eastern part of Poland. The Soviet Union actually worked actively with Nazi Germany to suppress freedom, not just in Poland, but also in other parts of Eastern Europe and Finland as well. So this past has been erased and was erased during the Soviet Union after 1941 and was replaced with this notion that, yeah, of course, the Soviets were always anti-fascist. This idea with the war going on in Russia today, a lot of Russians and sort of Russian sympathizers would say, how can Russians be the bad guys here? Historically, Russians are always anti-fascist. It must be those Ukrainians that are the real fascists. Now, another example of connections between 1984 and Stalinism is that Stalin literally erased people from pictures after they became what was known as unpeople in the Soviet Union during the purges of the 1930s. We'll discuss these purges later in the episode. Orwell's book is also full of portmanteaus, which is basically where you take separate words and you combine them to make a single word, something that Soviets and Bolsheviks going all the way back, right, they love doing this thing. It sounds so futuristic, right? Agitprop. What is agitprop? Agitation's propaganda. But it sounds cooler if we talk about agitprop. So in the book, the party also loves to do this. They call themselves Ingsoc for English socialism. They talk about newspeak. There's doublethink. Right? There's all these kind of words, portmanteaus and other contractions that become a part of the ideological structure of the new society. We could even go further. If you actually look at what posters of Big Brother resemble, the way they're described in the book, it actually looks a lot like Stalin, right? He's this kind of average-looking guy, the big bushy mustache in his 40s. This is a description of Stalin, more or less. The party's nemesis in the book is this guy named Emmanuel Goldstein, who is also basically Trotsky, right? Even the Jewish-sounding name, right? This is not very subtle to people that are reading the book in the late 1940s, coming right out of the experience of World War II. Anyways, to wrap all this up, the point is, again, 1984 is in some ways slightly fictionalized, slightly exaggerated, but it is kind of the version of Soviet life developed under Stalin. And it's meant to sort of inspire us and awaken in us a kind of anxiety or a fear about what would happen if Stalinism was applied to our own society. So it's a kind of interesting way to approach the idea of thinking about what is Stalin, what is Stalinism, what is Soviet life like in the 1930s, because one could argue it's actually even worse than it was in the 20s. We talked about this at length in our podcast on Lenin and on what Soviet life was like even after Lenin's death, but in the early to mid-20s, how much violence, how much death is going on. But the bad news is that it's going to get even worse under Stalin in the 1930s. For us, Stalin's Soviet Union was the nightmare come true. Unchecked and systematic violence combined with the absolute crushing of the human individual. And so, of course, it raises the question, how did this happen? How can we avoid it again? In today's episode, we're going to explore what the real, authentic, historical version of 1984 actually looked like. We're going to talk about the repression, the NKVD or secret police, the gulags, the mass killings, and the starvation of literally millions of people. Which, by the way, if you haven't noticed, part of what I've been trying to do in this series of lectures on communism is to bring home how violent and destructive the system was, why it inspired so much fear and anxiety in the democratic world. But that alone is not enough, because to really understand how this system could come about, we need to move past simple explanations that tend to focus on psychological or individual explanations. We love in the West, in Europe today, we love talking about Stalin as this kind of megalomaniac, super paranoid, super violent person. You know, he's crazy. How does the system come about? It's basically all Stalin's personality. If only we could go back in time and eliminate Stalin, maybe things wouldn't have turned out so bad. Stalin may have been paranoid to some extent, right? He was certainly vindictive. One could argue he was certainly an evil man, certainly responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of people. But for as much power as he possessed, he alone was not the system, nor did it come about simply because Marx or Lenin or other prominent Bolsheviks, they had their writings, their theories, playbook for people to follow. There's more to it than just that part of the story. One could argue Stalinism existed because millions of Russians and other nationalities living in the Soviet Union actively participated in it. They actively supported it, or they turned a blind eye towards its excesses. One could argue, as post-World War II Eastern European dissidents did, that the system survived because of the willingness of ordinary people to participate in it, either because they truly believed in the utopian goals of communism, or because they cynically wanted power and advancement, or because it was just easier to go along with it, to tell or accept the little lies that enabled one to live with one's own powerlessness. To put this another way, it's easy to imagine ourselves as a Winston or a Julia, the two protagonists of 1984 who resist against the system and who ultimately become victims of it. And it's easy to think of ourselves. We're in Star Wars. Of course we're going to be members of the Resistance. Of course we're going to be members of the Rebel Alliance. But what we need to understand, if we want to prevent these things from ever happening again, is how people became the O'Briens of 1984. O'Brien, if you haven't read the novel, is the chief interrogator. He's the one that kind of reveals everything that's going on, the whole kind of behind the scenes, behind the curtain picture at the end of the book. We need to understand the O'Briens, the people that are complicit, if we ever want to prevent something like this again. Finally, just one other point to make about Stalinism, and then I promise we'll actually start getting into the history rather than talking about why the history matters. As many of you know, we live in a world in which alternatives to democracy seem to be increasingly attractive. Democracy, after all, can be incredibly frustrating, or it can seem very weak. And in times of crisis, the idea of suspending the rule of law can be very appealing. One thinks here of Winston Churchill's famous quote that democracy is the worst form of government, all others accepted. Now, at the heart of this attraction is the idea of power and control, that by eschewing liberal democracy, our side can achieve some higher purpose. One could argue that this was, in essence, what the Bolsheviks were trying to do in the 1920s. Why debate things in committee? Why get bogged down because some senator has objected, some small block of lawmakers are preventing the will of the people from being kind of passed or implemented? Wouldn't it be better just to set all that stuff aside, get rid of it, and get down to power and do really amazing and consequential things? One could argue in some ways that that's what happens during the Civil War in the United States, right? Basically, the Republican Party is left in control of Congress because most of the Southern Democrats are now no longer a part of Congress, and that enables them to do amazing things, right? The Civil War isn't just the story of the fighting between the North and the South. It's also things like the Homestead Act. It's also things that set up the modern university systems, especially in places like Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, the land-grant schools, right? There is a whole bunch of stuff that is accomplished during Lincoln's presidency because suddenly there's no one in the way to kind of gum up the works. So doesn't it seem like it would make sense to create these sort of centers of power where we don't have to worry about democracy? We've kind of insulated ourselves from any threats because we, the party, have all the power. Well, part of the scary nature of Stalinism is that despite the Communist Party or the Bolshevik Party kind of taking and achieving all this power in the Soviet Union, the party members themselves did not have control. Power for the sake of power became the foundation of Soviet society. Violence became so integral to the system that it was not only used by the party against its enemies, but as we'll see, that violence actually rebounded against the very core of the party itself. Setting aside Stalin, the leaders of the 1917 revolution from almost all aspects of society were themselves destroyed just 1 or 2 decades later in the 1930s. Not only Stalin's political opponents like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, people we'll talk about, but also the leaders of the Red Army, the core of Soviet bureaucracy, and in the end, even many of the men and women who carried out the arrests, interrogations, and executions of their fellow citizens. As it did during the French Revolution, violence became all-consuming, a modern nightmare that in the end, even the Soviets themselves would try to walk away from because it consumed them as well. Again, I can't drive this point home far enough. The story of Stalinism is not just violence against everybody else in society, so wouldn't it be good to be a member of the party? The story of Stalinism is that the revolution eats its own. The violence destroys the very people that thought that they could use that violence to achieve some higher purpose. Okay, before we can get into all of the social and economic developments that are associated with Stalinism and communism in the 1930s, we need to flush out the story of Stalin's rise to power. Because as bad or ruthless as things were under Lenin, they hadn't quite reached, as I said, the systemic nature that they would under Stalin. There were still other directions that Soviet communism might have gone in that were perhaps slightly less totalitarian, whose violence would have been less systemic, right? They could have walked some things back. There was no guarantee that Stalin had to emerge as the leader or even as the dictator with absolute mastery by the early 1930s. But of course, Stalin did win out in the leadership struggles of the 1920s, and he followed this by building perhaps the most terrifying personal dictatorship history has so far witnessed. So again, how did he do this? Let's get into how he creates the dictatorship before we talk about some of its exegees. If you recall, Soviet government in its early years was essentially run by a small committee of 7 to 12 people known as the Politburo. This is basically the party apparatus. There's also a kind of official government sort of circle or group that runs the government, which is called the Sovnarkom. But in essence, the Politburo functions as the primary kind of committee running, if you will, the Soviet government. Until 1921, the Politburo was essentially led by Vladimir Lenin, who had been the leading mind behind the October Revolution. But it also included other figures such as Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, and the Leningrad party boss Grigory Zinoviev, who often disagreed with Lenin on various aspects of Bolshevik policy or tactics. Now, the committee itself was, at least in theory, democratic. During the Revolution and the Civil War, members of the committee often conflicted over various points of policy. One major question, for example, was what to do about the economy. Should they transition as quickly as possible into a full-on communist economy, right? Get rid of capitalism, get rid of money. Or did it make sense to kind of move slower, move by introducing some industrialization, use capital for a kind of pro-communist purpose, build up the power of the state, build up the power of the workers, and kind of create a hybrid system that eventually the capitalist side is going to wither away? Now, members of the Politburo debated these questions, sometimes passionately, but then once a vote occurred, everyone was expected to adopt the winning position. As Trotsky would later admit in the mid-1920s, the party is always right. One cannot be against the party. I'm kind of paraphrasing there. That's not a direct quote. Now, as I just mentioned, Lenin was basically the leader of the band. But by 1921, the physical and emotional toll of working 16-plus hours a day with little or no rest had finally caught up with him. And in May of 1922, he actually suffers the first of a series of massive strokes. To help him recover, they kind of pull him back from the day-to-day operations, and the Politburo soon falls prey to a fierce rivalry between some of Lenin's most capable assistants. Trotsky being the kind of number one figure, and Stalin being kind of number two. Now, Trotsky was the son of a well-off Jewish farmer who had risen to fame in revolutionary circles thanks to his election as president of the Petrograd Soviet in 1917. Trotsky is a fiery orator. He played a key institutional role by backing Lenin against both Kamenev and Zinoviev when they were talking about, should we start the revolution? Is the time right? Lev Kamenev, especially as the Bolshevik Revolution plays out, he has a tendency to kind of be like, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know if I want to commit to this. Let's slow things down. The time never seems to be right. Kamenev is not the most decisive Bolshevik, if you will. Now, after the Bolshevik Revolution begins, Trotsky also helps found the Red Army, And this puts him in a really powerful position post-Lenin. I've got the support of the army. That means I've got the guns, I've got the barbed wire, I've got the men, the force to seize power if I so desire. And of course, this idea is not something that the Bolsheviks are unaware of. They have the story of the French Revolution that they are in many ways looking at as the whole Russian Revolution is playing out. Right? What happens to the radicals during the French Revolution? Well, in addition to kind of killing each other because they can't control the violence, they are essentially replaced by Napoleon. So this idea of an army commander taking over is one that people are very aware of, and the Bolsheviks are a little bit concerned about it. At the same time, though, Trotsky is not the most popular guy. He's kind of arrogant, and if you look at pictures of him, he kind of looks like somebody who's arrogant. He's not someone that fit perfectly into sort of working man's Russian society or even early Soviet society. His name, as we mentioned, Trotsky, he was originally Bronstein. He was from a Jewish background. He was obviously not practicing Jew. And he had critically been a Menshevik for most of the pre-1917 era. So imagine you're part of a conspiratorial party, you're dealing with repression, you're fighting with other parties. Okay, you have a leader fighting it out. Okay, we're on the verge of triumph. And then all of a sudden, your movement is going to be kind of hijacked by somebody who wasn't really a member of your party, didn't agree with it until the decisive moment when they kind of came over to the winning side. Is this really the person that you want to succeed Lenin, who was the heart and soul of the party? As one historian has described Trotsky, he was, quote, not a natural comrade, end quote. So as we go into this kind of leadership struggle in the early 20s, the other potential rival is Joseph Stalin. Now, when we think about Joseph Stalin, we think about him as being this kind of ruthless dictator, as being angry, as being paranoid, as being a guy that you would definitely want to watch out for. You would never want to give that guy a bunch of power. But Stalin in the early 20s, the way that people perceive him is much different than who he becomes after he obviously becomes essentially the Soviet dictator. Stalin came from Georgia, the country. He was from a broken home, and he had, for a time, actually attended Orthodox seminar. There was a time in his teens where he actually wanted to be a priest, and then obviously went a different way. Now, despite his hard image in the West, Stalin was seen as more of the quiet guy, the sort of efficient bureaucrat, the guy who's going to take on the jobs that nobody else really wants to do. Right? If you have a meeting, do you want to be the person dealing with all the paperwork? Do you want to be the person taking notes? No, you don't. I've been in meetings. I've had to do it. It sucks. Right? People want to be the decisive leader. Hey, I've got this brilliant idea. I want to flush things out. People want the more prestigious positions. People, of course, as we talked about, they always want to be the foreign minister. They want to be dealing with defense. They want to be dealing with jobs that seem exciting. To be in charge of the party, to be in charge of promotions and nominations and assignments, that doesn't seem so exciting. In the late teens, early 20s, Stalin is the guy who basically winds up doing a lot of these types of jobs. He's the quiet, dependable guy in the room, an excellent organizer who would do the jobs, as I said, that nobody else really wants to do. In 1917, he became editor of the party paper, Pravda, which means truth, which, of course, there was a lot of lies in Pravda, a lot of untruth, but there you see the way the party uses language to achieve its ends, right? The most propagandistic source of information in Soviet society is literally called truth. Stalin quickly moved up the ranks. He became a member of the Politburo. And under Lenin's dictatorship, Stalin also served as the Commissar for Nationalities, which, again, if you're a Bolshevik, you're not supposed to have nationalities, right? The idea is that people are going to forget about their national identity. They're going to move towards class identity. So why would you want to be in charge of nationalities in what becomes the Soviet Union? For Lenin, this is a way to kind of get people to buy into the Soviet system, right? There's a little bit of a carrot, a little bit of a, hey, you Ukrainians, you can be a little bit more Ukrainian, but just do it within the communist system, become communists first, and we can include that, right? So not a prestigious position, but Stalin winds up doing the job. He also becomes chairman of the Secretariat, again, the person that's in charge of promotions, assignments, things like that. And in 1922, he becomes the first general secretary of the party. kind of funny way to think about this, if you will, is that Joseph Stalin is the original head of the Bolshevik HR department. Right? That's what he does. He's in charge of HR. Now, while these positions were not glamorous, they enabled Stalin to build a loyal network of supporters within the base of the party. In other words, every time someone comes up for a promotion, every time we have to think, which comrade are we going to put in the office of military affairs in what becomes Leningrad, Stalin is the one who is making that choice. Another thing that he gets to do is receive all the reports from the secret police about everybody. Because he's, choosing who's loyal, who's not, where do we want to put people. I need to know all their secrets. And that puts him in an incredibly powerful position. In 1922 alone, Stalin appointed more than 100,000 provincial officials. That's hard to do, 100,000 officials, right? But Stalin is not only doing it to kind of, say, we got to do this, let's get the job done, but he's picking people that are loyal to him. He knows that you're a big Trotsky fan, you're going to wind up in Siberia. If he knows that you are part of his patronage network, you say, wink, wink, Stalin, I love you, you're great, I would support you through anything, you are going to do well. Finally, Stalin also benefits in this leadership struggle from the idea that he is not very talented, that he's a kind of mediocre guy and not very ambitious. But if you want to win one of these game shows where it's like, let's vote people off the island, right? Survivor. How do you win Survivor? Well, you form alliances, you form networks and things like that. You don't want to be seen as the guy or girl who is most likely to win. You don't want to be the one that's the obvious first choice because then everybody gangs up against that person and gets rid of them. So Stalin doesn't seem like much of a threat. And people say, well, we know the story of Napoleon. We know the story of the French Revolution. We are much more worried about this Trotsky guy who isn't really one of us to begin with. Now, again, this is going to seem strange, but in these Politburo meetings, right, they're arguing about stuff. They get heated. They get upset. Stalin is the guy who is the voice of moderation in the early years of Bolshevik rule. Right? They say, Trotsky tried to do something. We voted him down. Let's punish him. Let's kick him out of the party. Let's get him. Stalin is the one that says, no, comrades. He's an old Bolshevik. We must be moderate with him. We must be understanding with him. Stalin is the one advocating forgiveness for error and compromise, which is so crazy because once we get to the 1930s, Stalin is the one who essentially greenlights any deviation, any heresy, any argument is not going to be tolerated. But again, they don't know this in the early 1920s after Lenin has his stroke. Stalin seems like a preferable alternative to Trotsky, who seems much more likely to embrace the idea of becoming a dictator. Okay, so after Lenin's stroke, right, he's pulled away from government. There emerge these kind of blocks within the Politburo. And the key anti-Trotsky voting bloc is formed by Stalin, who allies with Kamenev and Zinoviev to form what historians call the left opposition. Now, Lenin returns in the fall of 1922, and he kind of becomes suspicious of this bloc. He doesn't like the idea that this is going on. One of the things that they do, which is quite clever but also piss Lenin off quite a bit, is they wait until he gets kind of tired in the meeting, he excuses himself, and then once he's gone, now they're going to introduce the big consequential questions, right? That's when we're going to propose the major legislation, the major resolutions. And that way we don't have to worry about what Lenin thinks and people aren't going to defer to him. This situation, however, doesn't last very long because in December 1922, Lenin suffers a second stroke. And from this point onward, he basically exercises no influence on the situation. In fact, who is going to take over and supervise Lenin's doctors in the aftermath of this second stroke? Oh, well, it just happens to be the party secretary, who is Joseph Stalin. Stalin basically gets reports on what Lenin is thinking, who he's contacting, what he's writing. And then he also kind of gets to speak for Lenin in the Politburo meetings. Now, as all this is going on, Trotsky is kind of aware. He sees Lenin is fading. He's worried about Stalin's rising power. And so Trotsky decides to kind of position himself against Stalin And he does this by attacking the idea of bureaucratization in the Soviet Union. In other words, this is the idea that we had this beautiful, sweet, romantic revolution. We were implementing communism. We were getting rid of the state and the authority of the czar. And then somewhere along the way, it just kind of got taken over by bureaucrats. We lost the inertia. We lost the real rebellious spirit of the revolution. And so what we need to do is to get rid of some of those bureaucrats. And so, of course, this makes perfect sense, right? We live in a society where that word bureaucrat is not a positive word. If I said, oh, bureaucrat, oh, bureaucracy, the first thing people think about is inefficiency, is some government official coming here to tell you what to do and not really even knowing what they should be telling you. This idea of sort of trying to rally the party against Stalin, however, proved to be an enormous tactical error by Trotsky. Again, most of the rank-and-file members don't love him. And it enables Stalin then to turn around and say, look, you, Trotsky, are sowing seeds of division and factionalism in the party. Why have we been successful so far in the Russian Revolution? Have we avoided the fate of the French revolutionaries? It's because we've stayed united. And now you're the one that's trying to break things up. You need to be punished or you need to be censured for this view. And so essentially this is what happens in October 1924. Trotsky is censured by the Politburo. There is talk of kicking him out of the party altogether, except Stalin reaches in and says, no, comrades. Again, he's been censured. He's learned his lesson. He's, come back. He said he accepts the rule of the party. Let's not kick him out. And so again, Stalin seems very reasonable, very moderate. Why wouldn't you then throw in your lot with Stalin? And now, as always happens when we get these sort of situations in history where we have like a triumvirate or troika, if you prefer the more Slavic sounding phrase, it never really lasts, right? There's always three people and two of them are always going to gang up on one of them and try to drive them out, right? If you have two other siblings, two brothers, two sisters, you know that there's always like a kind of alliance that forms between two of them. There's always sort of a more close relationship between two of them to the exclusion of the third one. And so, again, this Stalin-Kamenev-Zinoviev triumvirate begins to break up in 1925, just a year after the sort of Trotsky opposition or the left opposition has been dealt with. And so historians refer to this period as the new opposition. Kamenev and Zinoviev say, the Stalin guy is dangerous. Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, also agrees with them. And this time they come forth and they say, look, Stalin, you are the problem. We need to get rid of you. We need to demote you a little bit. We need to take away some of your power. When this moment happens, Stalin turns towards some of the new leaders of the Bolshevik Party, or the Communist Party at this point. Some of the key names here are Nikolai Bukharin, who became editor of Pravda. And the editor of the party paper, again, when Stalin first does this in the 19-teens, to be the editor of the paper is kind of annoying, right? Oh, you've got to sit there, you've got to read all these articles, you've got to, it's very intellectual work, doesn't seem very exciting. But what the party paper does is it kind of tells everybody else what they're supposed to think. These are the official positions of the party. These are the tendencies, these are the goals that we're thinking of. And then people can kind of work towards that on their own. So to be the editor of the party paper is a fairly significant position, and Bukharin becomes, in the late 20s, a very important voice. Another name was the Soviet Prime Minister, Alexei Rykov. And both of these men, as they're thinking about this issue of the Soviet economy, both of them are more on the moderate side of transitioning to communism. Both of them are saying, well, we want communism, but let's go at a slower pace. Let's not, make people suffer more than we have to. So across 1925, again, Kamenev, Zinoviev, they're a little bit, suspicious of Stalin. And in December of 1925, Kamenev actually takes the dispute into the open, calling for the removal of Stalin as general secretary. To make a long story short, Kamenev and Zinoviev lose the subsequent vote. They said Kamenev had done a lot of losing of votes in the run-up to the Bolshevik Revolution. Zinoviev, also kind of arrogant, somewhat of a womanizer. Right? They're not quite as powerful as they seem. Now, in the communist system, when you have these votes, a lot of times it's not just okay, do we disagree with each other? Okay, you vote that way, I'll vote this way, fine. Usually when someone loses, they're punished. And so this is exactly what happens, right? Kamenev, again, trying to sort of say, we got to get rid of Stalin. Stalin says, well, you are creating factionalism. And so Kamenev is actually kicked off the Politburo. And again, Zinoviev was as well. But then, he's kind of brought back in. He apologizes. But in the meantime, Stalin gets rid of Zinoviev's supporters in Leningrad and replaces them with people that seem more loyal to Stalin. Okay, we've had the left opposition. We've had the new opposition. What follows? Kamenev and Zinoviev don't want to kind of admit their defeat. And so they think, what can we do? Oh, yeah, there was that guy Trotsky. He was against Stalin too. Let us start talking to him to see what we can do to again get rid of Stalin. So in 1926, there is again a call for Stalin's removal, including Trotsky this time. But again, the conspirators lose. And as a result, in 1927, all three men are expelled from the party, although Kamenev and Zinoviev again are later readmitted after they recant and after they tell their supporters, we screwed up, Stalin is the guy you should be listening to. Now, also, when they come back, they don't get to come back to the Politburo. They don't get to be equals with Stalin. They are they have some support, but in some ways, they're also unpeople. They're people that you're like, I don't know if I want to associate with them because they're seen as losers. They're seen as anti-Stalin, and they kind of get shunned a little bit. One last group to emerge, this time in 1928, and this is known as the right opposition. For reasons that we will discuss in a moment, Stalin decided to accelerate the transition to communism, launching a new program known as Collectivization. This would entail, again, this requisition of grain from peasants, collective farms. Again, we sort of saw them try this in the early 1920s, and we saw how it failed. Bukharin, in particular, strenuously opposed these measures, which he felt would inhibit the transition to socialism. Bukharin's defense of the peasantry, however, drew the ire of the rest of the party. Stalin portrayed him as being proto-capitalist and denounced him. And in 1929, Bukharin, now sort of after siding with Stalin through so many of these leadership fights, what does he do? He makes the same mistake that Kamenev and Zinoviev made. Okay, I need more support to be able to go up against Stalin. Let me go to the people that Stalin has already defeated, in this case, Lev Kamenev, and of course, Grigory Zinoviev. When he does this, this leads to him being labeled as a factionalist. He is expelled from the Politburo and removed as the editor of Pravda. So by the end of 1929, Stalin basically has control of the Politburo. One could say that he had established somewhat of a dictatorship, but it's not absolute, right? They still have these debates. Stalin, of course, speaks last when they have these discussions, which, as you can imagine, might have been a little nerve-wracking for the people participating in it. But there is still some degree of independence, right? People in the Communist Party can still have disagreements about what do we think the best policy is, how should we approach a certain issue. Stalin is the leader and will ultimately follow, kind of mostly what he says, but we can still think independently. And this is a key issue that is going to come up in just a second. Because in a totalitarian system, it's not enough just to be assured that you can win elections or votes or be feted as the leader. Right? You're the leader one day, but that doesn't mean that other people can't scheme, can't have thoughts about someone else one day leading the party. In a totalitarian society, you need absolute control, not just over society itself, but especially over your own supporters. There can be no independent thought, no independent will. And this fact was not yet clear to Stalin's supporters in the Politburo, although, as we'll see, in the 1930s, it gets made abundantly clear to them. In 1932, Soviet police arrested a former high-ranking Communist Party member named Martiman Ryutin, who was the son of a peasant family who had penned a 200-page manifesto calling for an end to forced collectivization and for the removal of Stalin. So again, this seems like kind of a person's closer to being on the ground, reacting to circumstances. Like Bukharin, was kind of more sympathetic to the peasantry. And so he criticizes the leader and he opposes the leader. And it's clear that by having said it's not just enough to be critical of the policy, but saying we're going to remove the leader, that makes him someone that cannot be tolerated. And so Stalin is obviously outraged, and he actually calls for the death penalty for Ryutin. Pretty much all the members of the Politburo agree that this is a grievous mistake that Ryutin has made. They don't want him to be part of the Communist Party anymore. They say, we got to punish this guy. This is, again, he's a mistake. He's erred, wrong, whatever. But they balk at the idea of executing him. They say to themselves, this guy Ryutin, yes, he may have made mistakes now. Maybe he's too sympathetic towards the peasants, but he's an old Bolshevik. He was one of us. He was in the streets when the initial October Revolution happened. He has a lot of credit and deserves some respect because no matter what he's done now, he still was somebody that really put his life on the line and is how we got to where we are now. In 1932, when the issue comes up, Stalin does not have enough support to overcome the will of the Politburo. And one of the key kind of figures in blocking him and opposing him is the new Leningrad party boss, Sergei Kirov. So instead of getting the death penalty, they sentence Ryutin to 10 years of prison. But Stalin would remember the insubordination of the Politburo. Stalin would remember these guys, even though they support me, even though they give me power, even though they defer to me on most things, they still think they have an independence of thought. They still think that I care about their opinion, that I'm going to weigh their opinion, that their opinion counts for something. And so he waits till the opportune moment to take revenge on them. That moment comes on December 1st, 1934. On that day, you have a disgruntled former Communist Party member. And again, he's fallen on hard times. He's upset. His name is Leonid Nikolaev. And he sneaks into the Smolny Institute where he assassinates Sergei Kirov by shooting him in the back of the head with a revolver. As you might expect, Nikolaev was arrested. He's put on trial and is later executed. But for Stalin, this is not a question of justice, not a question of who is responsible for the assassination of Kirov. This is an opportunity. This is a chance to settle scores with people that you don't like. And so as they begin, in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Kirov, a kind of judicial process, an investigation, what happened, how did this guy get there, how did he know where Kirov would be, the interrogators, the investigators, are not focused on trying to literally figure out how did this happen, but they try to associate Kirov's killer with Stalin's rivals. Now, we should say before we go on any further that there are some theories out there that this was an inside job, that Stalin himself may have ordered this killing or may have manipulated the security services to make the killing possible. Actually, Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, actually makes this accusation in his memoirs. Whether or not these things are true, we don't know. But what we do know is that Stalin's security forces were successful in creating these links or creating these ideas of association so that killing Kirov becomes synonymous with the idea of opposing Stalin. The major leaders who had opposed Stalin in the past, the Trotskys, the Kamenevs, the Zinovievs, for example, are arrested. Although Trotsky is kind of tried in absentia because he's actually in exile at the time, he actually survives until 1940 when he gets an ice pick through the skull in Mexico City, and that's the end of Trotsky. But the purge, or what's beginning to become the purge, goes beyond just the question of, okay, here's my chief rivals, let me eliminate them. Instead, Stalin wants to send a message. Their friends, their families, their supporters are also arrested. We're talking about 15,000 people, all in all, with a further 177,000 people who get expelled from the party. that number is breathtaking if you think about it. If we said, okay, there was the assassination of President Kennedy, 177,000 people bear responsibility for it. Wow, that's a massive number. Now, in modern American society or modern European society, if something like this happened, we would go, wow, this is a coup in motion. This is problematic. This is extraordinary. This is a big deal. But remember, in the Soviet Union, the idea of using violence and extra-legal measures against your enemies for political purposes, this is something that they had used already by the Bolsheviks, by the Cheka, during the seizure of power in 1917 and moving forward from there. Right? They went after the socialist revolutionaries. They went after the Mensheviks. They went after the civil servants. They used violence as a tool to further politics, not just for justice, as we would somewhat allow for or see as legitimate today. And so again, this notion of normalizing violence is going to rebound back upon the party in the process of these purges that we're getting into right now. Now, the primary agency responsible for carrying out these investigations was known as the NKVD, which was founded in 1917 to oversee the Soviet Union's prison and labor camps. By 1930, it had assumed control of law enforcement activity in the country, and later on that would also include border control functions, espionage, in a wide range of party disciplinary functions. To carry out these purges, the NKVD not only wanted to physically eliminate Stalin's rivals, but like in 1984, tremendous amounts of energy went into breaking them psychologically as well. Suspects had to admit their guilt, even if their only crime was really opposition or independence from Stalin. To achieve this effect, they were usually arrested and held overnight until they confessed to some of the most heinous crimes, all involving some form of conspiracy or treason. Alliance with any number of groups long maligned by Soviet authorities: Jews, foreign nationals, bourgeois types, the Orthodox Church. All of this is common. Those who resisted were placed on a sort of thing called the conveyor belt. The conveyor belt is not like an actual machine. It's basically a system for interrogations where you don't let the person sleep, you don't let the person sit down or even lean against a wall. And basically by physically and mentally exhausting them, within about 3 days, you can get anybody to say anything you want. Here is someone like Zinoviev, who is a core Bolshevik member, an old Bolshevik, a leader of the October Revolution in 1917. How on earth could you get him to confess to being a Western agent, working with various foreign nationals, being a secret like bourgeois guy? How could you get him to say something like that? Well, basically, they don't let him sleep, they don't let him rest, and eventually they break him as they do pretty much everybody else. Now, once they have these confessions, they can stage trials, and this will come in the mid-1930s. But you get people like Kamenev, Zinoviev, later on, to some extent, Bukharin, although Bukharin tries to resist a little bit more than the other two do. And you say, okay, repeat these confessions. Tell the Soviet people how you were secretly a foreign agent. And they do this. And they do this because they've been promised, like, if you do this, fine, we'll show mercy. We did it in the past. Of course, we'll do it again in the future. We'll let you go. We'll let your son go. We'll let your family go. You can't be a major figure in politics anymore, but you can go be a farmer and we won't hurt your kids. And so again, they break people. And in doing so, they create this next level that makes some of the lies, makes some of the repression more believable. More believable not only to the people that are the general populace as a whole, but to the people that are actually supporting the system, right? To the interrogators. They need to hear the defendant say, I committed this treason, I committed these crimes, because then that legitimates the actions that they're taking. It's really, really hard for people psychologically to commit murder, right? To think, I illegitimately took the life of someone else. It's much easier if they can justify it, if they say, well, that person wasn't a good person, they were a liar, they were an abuser, they were an exploiter, right? There's some higher purpose justifying my use of violence or my own repression of them. So that psychological aspect is so key to the system that is being set up and then driven by Stalin in the 1930s with the purges. By the start of 1936, Stalin had eliminated, in a political sense, any internal opposition inside the Soviet Union. But again, practical victory was not enough. Like the party in 1984, Stalin does not want loyalty, which still implies some degree of agency, right? If I think about who am I loyal to, that's a choice that I'm making to give my allegiance to someone else. And if I'm making that choice, then theoretically one day I can revoke that loyalty. What Stalin wants is total submission. You do not have the ability to think about whether or not you support Stalin. It's become a natural reflex, and you just inherently do it no matter what he calls for. It's not enough for his supporters then to simply reject the opponents, to condemn them, to condemn their political positions. The supporters themselves needed to be constantly vigilant, constantly on the lookout for any sign of heresy. Right? There cannot be moments of relaxation, of breath. There cannot be moments of private thought in a totalitarian system. And so by putting everyone on constant vigilance, constant alert, constant, make sure I don't have any heresy, make sure that I'm actively looking for heresy in other people, then mentally it takes away my freedom. So to push the party more in this direction, massive numbers of arrests continued into the mid-1930s. Party members were accused, not with necessarily even being a Trotsky supporter, a Zinoviev supporter, a Bukharinite, or something like that, but they are accused of a lack of vigilance. Why did you not denounce this guy that you worked in the office with that we have just arrested? Why are you married to someone who we've just decided has, links to suspect organizations? They're going to be arrested. How were you their husband or wife and you didn't pick up on it? You must be guilty, not of sympathy for them, but of basically laziness, again, of a lack of vigilance, a failure to take your responsibilities seriously. And so we see this across Soviet society. Marriages are dissolved as one party tries to save themselves from guilt by association with their partners. Now, to willingly associate with groups of people who were opposed to Stalin, to be a part of a conspiracy, this was a risk, of course, that one could be aware that one was taking. We've all seen in various either fictional or historical episodes, right? There are people with power, people who oppose the power. You know when you join a conspiracy that you are taking risks with your life and potentially even with those of your family or friends or supporters or something like that. But to be arrested simply because you did not denounce a colleague or a friend who is not overtly political, this strikes us as quite arbitrary. It's almost like saying, okay, it's bad enough that you're in this sort of hellish game and people are being arrested and, if you say the wrong thing, you could be shot. This is how a lot of people tend to think about Nazi Germany, even though Nazi Germany is not quite as bad as this image that we have, this fantasy that we have. But the Stalinist model, the Soviet model, is in some ways even worse. You are not even aware of the rules of the life and death game that the party is forcing you to play. There is no safe play in Stalinist Soviet Union in the 1930s, and to some extent in the late 40s and early 50s. Right? It's not like in Eastern Europe in the 80s, or if you want to think about Nazi Germany, where I say, oh, okay, I know if I come out and I say Hitler's a bum, we should overthrow him, he's a bad guy. Okay, I know bad things are going to happen to me, so if I just keep my head down, then I'll be left alone. Part of the nightmare of Stalinism is that strategy doesn't work. In fact, they go after people like that who keep their head down because it's not enough just to say, I'm not going to oppose you, I'm powerless. They want to take your mind and make you actively a part of the system. And what we've been talking about so far, again, are referred to as the Great Purges. And these happen across the mid to late 1930s. But the showcase event comes in August of 1936, when several of the old Bolsheviks that I mentioned, including Kamenev and Zinoviev, are put on trial in Moscow. And as I mentioned, here they confess to a litany of conspiratorial charges, extracted through beatings, torture, threats against their families, and other forms of encouragement. And as I said, they're also, kind of assured, if you play ball, if you make these confessions, things will be okay. And so, again, they go through the process and they provide Stalin with evidence of a conspiracy that never really existed. Millions and millions of people can believe the lies because of the lies that the people being consumed by the system told as they were being consumed. Stalin, of course, double-crosses these old Bolsheviks. They were quickly executed after the trials so that they could no longer threaten him. But the nightmare doesn't end there. The trials actually continued in 1937 and 1938, with most of the senior old Bolsheviks accused of participating in these kind of, again, fantastic plots of terror and espionage against Stalin and the Soviet state. This included some of Lenin's closest associates, Karl Radek and Grigory Pyatakov in 1937, Bukharin, Rykov, and the former head of the NKVD himself, Henryk Yagoda, in 1938, after Yagoda kind of falls out of favor for not being aggressive enough in terms of purges. So imagine that, right? Your main guy who's organizing all the trials, all the purges, all the basically assassinations or judicial assassinations, they kill that guy as a way to say to the next guy, up your game. Be vigilant, be proactive. Do not think for a second about what you want. You must defend Stalin. Eventually, these purges grow beyond, again, those who were just shunned by the party itself. Soviet authorities, including Stalin himself, basically, they just draw up a list or quotas. Stalin will literally write a memo to someone and say, hey, go arrest 10,000 people. We need 10,000 conspirators found. Don't worry if they're actually conspirators. Just go find and arrest people for conspiracy. And that way you'll motivate everybody else. Again, these crimes, oftentimes they can be accused of being participants in the conspiracies, can be negligence, failures of vigilance, etc. But it includes wide swaths of Soviet society. They go after the lowly Bolshevik school teachers and artists. They go after the district and the regional party bosses. They go after the army, right? You don't want independent thought in the army. They could resist me. They could one day take over. The army is purged in the mid to late 1930s, including the speedy trial and execution of Marshal Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky was the hero of the Russo-Polish War in 1920. He is literally a Soviet hero. He's held up as being one of the best and brightest and most supportive of communism. And all of a sudden, then he's a traitor, he's whisked away, and he's executed. The same thing happens to the chief of the general staff, 15 of 16 of the regional army commanders, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, 60 out of 67 corps commanders, 136 of 199 divisional commanders. If you want to know one of the reasons that the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, it's because they figure the Soviets have just killed all of their senior commanders. They struggle in the Finnish War in 1940. The Red Army looks like a giant mess because they just killed everybody that's in the leadership cadres. But again, it goes further than just the army. Later, the NKVD itself is purged, including Yagoda's successor, Nikolai Ioseb, the chief architect of the purges, the guy that was brought in to kill the other guy, to like motivate everybody to be in the purges. The prosecutors' offices, the police are also purged. So much that it's not uncommon to hear of inmates in, again, the late 1930s who encounter their former interrogators who are also behind bars. By the time the Great Purges end, right on the eve of World War II, 110 of the 139 Central Communist Party committee members who had attended the party congress in 1934 were arrested. Think about that number again, 110 of 139 of the main, most important, most prestigious communist leaders in 1934. Just 5 years later, they're gone. Of the 1,966 delegates to the same party meeting, over 1,100 had disappeared just 5 years later by 1939. These are astounding figures. By the time things had run their course, over 1.6 million people had been arrested as part of the Great Purges, and approximately 700,000 of them had died. And again, it's not just the opponents of Stalin. It's not just the people who were kind of obvious suspects, the people that resisted him, the people that didn't want to go along with him. It is also his most fervent supporters. It is the very people, in many cases, that are leading the executions, that are leading the interrogations, that are running the camps. The system eats itself and eats the people that participate in it. Now, one of the popular explanations that one tends to hear about, why does this happen? Why do we get the Great Purges? Is this notion that it's driven by Stalin's personality, right? Stalin is supposedly this kind of paranoid guy, so he acts very irrationally, and everything can basically be traced back to him, right? Again, no Stalin, no super repressive measures, no mass purge, 700,000 people would have survived. Without getting into, again, the nuances of Stalin's mind, it's worth noting here that there was certainly more to the story than just the question of Stalin's mental state. Another factor pushing or encouraging these widespread arrests is that it serves an economic function as well, providing the Soviet Union with what was essentially free labor. We're going to talk more in the next episode about the Soviet economy under Stalin, but here it's enough to note that in the late 1920s, he and other leading Bolsheviks came to see prison labor as a potential and powerful resource for jump-starting the transformation or industrialization of the Soviet economy. The result was the construction of hundreds of work camps for political prisoners where human life was valued only by the amount of labor that it could perform. We're speaking here, of course, about something called the Gulag, which was an acronym for the Main Camp Administration. Gulags were essentially a work camp. If you want to call it a concentration camp, you could also draw a strong correlation there. It's very similar in terms of its purposes. But this concentration camp soon became a core part of Soviet society under Stalin. Now, again, the basic idea of a gulag, concentration camp, this exists for a long time, right? Where are we going to put our political prisoners? Right, going back to the Tsarist period, there's plenty of political prisoners. In the early days of the Bolshevik seizure of power, opponents of the regime are also often arrested, and they get sent to these camps for political prisoners in order to perform forced labor. For example, in 1923, the first official Gulag site is opened on a former monastery complex on the island of Solovetsky in the White Sea. Now, these early Gulags are terrible places, right? The idea is to punish your opponents. You've got political prisoners, you've got former members of the SRs, the Mensheviks, something like that. You're not just isolating them for the purpose of isolating them, but you also want to send a message, and so they dole out quite a bit of punishment as well, right? Especially in the camp system itself. You want to teach the prisoners that they have no power, they have no legitimacy, they have no rights. One of the really awful forms of torture that they come up with at Solovetsky, which, again, it's in northern Russia, so it's very cold in the wintertime, but in the summertime, it's warmer and you can get a lot of mosquitoes. And so what they do is they basically tie prisoners naked to a tree and they just leave them there for hours and hours and hours. So imagine, you go to a place where there's a lot of mosquitoes, go to your local swamp, and they just strip you down naked and you're tied up. You can't swat the mosquitoes, and they just bite you and bite you and bite you. That's what happens to the lucky political prisoners in the early 20s. If you're not so lucky, they just shoot you, get it over with. But by the late 1920s, several factors converged to transform these camps into something even more ghastly, where the focus was not just on doling out punishment, but on exploiting the labor of the prisoners rather than carrying out an isolating or, again, a punishing factor. By the time you get to the middle of the 1920s, Soviet planners have become disenchanted with the idea of, again, the basic labor camp because, after all, it's expensive to keep prisoners, right? You have to have guards, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to give them resources. And so there becomes this intense focus on how can we make these prison camps economically viable? How can we make it so that they pay for themselves and they're not so much of a drain on the Soviet economy? In the mid-1920s, basically a prisoner named Naftali Frenkel, who had been arrested for crossing borders illegally, for engaging in some smuggling, supposedly Frenkel drops a letter to the camp commandant where he helpfully outlines ways that the camp could be made more economically productive. Again, it's unclear how decisive this was, but apparently this letter made its way up to the Soviet bureaucracy, and Frenkel was actually permitted an early release in 1927. Already, by 1925, he had been placed in charge of running the camp's economic department. So he's a prisoner, but he becomes a privileged prisoner because of his efforts to make the camps more self-sufficient. And here, Frenkel supposedly develops a really ghastly, horrific idea. He says basically, in order to incentivize people to work, right, if you're a prisoner, they put you in the prison yard, you're working, okay, you're going to work, but how hard are you going to work, right? There's no incentive. It's not like you're going to get time off if you work really hard or, you make more money. So Frenkel comes up with this really evil way of incentivizing labor. He creates a three-tiered system of prisoners. There are those that can do heavy labor, those that can do light labor, and those who he deems are not capable of any labor at all, right? These are people that are weak. These may be kind of sexist to say this, but it could be women or children. It could also be that they have disease or that they're just exhausted. But basically what he says is that your level of compensation, which will be paid out in food, is based upon which labor group you're in. If you're doing the heavy labor, we are going to give you 800 grams of bread and 80 grams of meat per week. We're going to give you enough so that at least as long as you're doing the heavy labor, you can survive. Those who can only do light labor receive 500 grams of bread and 40 grams of meat. So basically, if you're not going to do the hardest work there, you're only going to get half of the rations that the people doing the hard work are doing. And if you're someone who doesn't work at all, you receive 400 grams of bread and 40 grams of meat. And so basically what tends to happen is if you are someone who is weak, if you are someone who is sick, someone who can't work, do the heavy labor, you starve to death. If you are someone that can do the heavy labor, at times, those people over time, they break down. They're not in the best elements. They don't have the best clothes. There basically is not a lot of support for what they're doing. There's not heavy machinery for digging some of the major projects that they get involved in. Right? If I said, here's a shovel, go break rocks. Here's a pickaxe, go break rocks. Maybe you're the type of person that could do that for a month or two. But eventually we all kind of break down, especially if we're not getting enough food. So again, the arithmetic here is ghastly. What happens to the people that are just consuming resources? They die. And because they die, it makes the bottom line look better. Now, Frenkel also transitioned the focus of prison labor away from these kind of esoteric schemes such as harvesting Arctic plants and more towards the type of unskilled physical projects that anyone could contribute to. One of the biggest projects, one of the earliest projects is 1931. They began construction on something called the White Sea Canal. Now, in Russia and the Soviet Union, so it's true in today's Russia, but also obviously in the Soviet Union in the 40s, one of the big problems is that you don't have a lot of warm water ports. When it gets to be wintertime, your ports are going to freeze up, and so it's really hard to sail from the northern ports in places like Archangel or Murmansk to try to go all the way around like the end of Norway, go all the way around to the Baltic Sea. It's very expensive, a lot of ice. So they say, what if we made a canal so that I could go from the northern part to Leningrad and not ever actually leave Soviet waters, never go north to where it's getting colder. And so they envisioned this idea of this canal to link again the White and Baltic Seas. Over the course of 21 months, 170,000 prisoners laboriously dug 141 miles of trenches to complete one of the first great success stories of the Stalinist era. But like many of these success stories, this victory came at a great cost. Between 12,000 and 25,000 prisoners die building this canal. And they die partly from exposure, but especially from exhaustion, from a lack of food, because of Frankel's system. Now, we should also add that the finished product was not quite everything that the Soviets had imagined it will be. We'll talk about some issues with the Soviet economy more in our next podcast episode, but basically one of the things that the Soviets like to do is they drive everybody at a breakneck pace. They don't invest the proper resources. They don't take the time to do the job right, and they pay the price for cutting corners, right? They dig this giant canal, great, wonderful, except we actually didn't dig it quite as deep as it should have been. We're making this canal, but we don't have the concrete or the metal that we would use if we were building kind of big modern construction project. And so there tends to be more erosion, right? It tends to be less sturdy. When they dig the canal, they're forced to use wooden spades, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, and so the depth of the canal can only reach 12 feet, which is not deep enough for modern ships to navigate. So older ships can use the canal. It does have some purpose. It does achieve something beyond just the propagandistic value, but it doesn't quite work as effectively as they thought it would. So in the end, the real value of the White Sea Canal proves to be propagandistic. As Stalin is getting ready for those leadership battles in the late 1920s, early 1930s, right, where he's trying to not just be the leader, but to become a totalitarian leader, to have absolute control, this gives Stalin an image of progress that justifies the other excesses of the Soviet system. Now, unfortunately, the failures of projects like the White Sea Canal are not enough to dissuade Stalin from expanding the idea of using forced labor. In fact, the desire for more labor helps underwrite a new series of purges that, as I mentioned, were launched in the mid to late 1930s that swell the Gulag population to over 2 million Soviet citizens. By the time the Gulags were closed in 1953, over 18 million Soviet citizens had served time in them, with about 1.5 million people dying. That's the equivalent of 1/4 of the Holocaust. And it happened in the Soviet Union because people became, in essence, a kind of commodity, a kind of fuel that could be consumed in the great drive to transform society. Now, as if all this isn't bad enough, there is even more. We've been speaking so far about politics and what amounts to political repression. But all of this was done in the name of an even greater undertaking, which was the remaking of the Soviet economy. We'll get into this more in the next episode, but here it's enough to note that Stalin's goal was the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union. And when I say rapid, I mean transforming what was largely an agricultural and a mineral-rich economy into a modern industrial one in about 5 to 10 years. To give you an idea of how fundamental such change was going to be, this is a process that had played out over a century in the UK and over several decades in most European and American states. Now, to carry out this process, Stalin relied on a series of 5-year plans, wherein Soviet bureaucrats would oversee the construction of thousands of industrial plants, manage resources related to production, and in some cases, even build entirely new cities. But it also involved the harvesting of millions of tons of grain from the countryside, which could be used to feed the newly built cities or sold abroad to fund industrial development. To speed the process along, leading Bolsheviks had called for the collectivization of agriculture, forcing small farmers to band together in collective farms called kolkhoz. As we saw in our podcast on Lenin, however, these collective farms were not very efficient. Peasants greatly resisted participating in them, to the extent that in 1921, Lenin effectively had given up on the plan, or he had at least decided on a tactical retreat. Historians disagree. They kind of argue back and forth about how permanent Lenin thought the new economic policy was in the early 20s, but at any rate, they were revisited in the late 1920s after his death. In 1928, however, a decline in grain prices led the party to reintroduce grain requisition as an emergency measure. Once more, teams of Soviet agents, about 100,000 people, went into the countryside, harassing peasants and compelling them to surrender their grain. Once more, the peasants resisted, sometimes hiding grain, other times simply planning less so that they would have less grain in the future. By the end of 1928, the consequences of this collectivization again were so bad that the Soviet authorities had to reintroduce food rationing. The Soviet state was on the verge of open war with its own peasantry. Once again, violence appeared to Soviet leaders to be the best tool for accomplishing their goals. At the end of 1929, all farmers were forced to join the kolkhoz. Kulaks, or wealthier farmers, or people who are kind of envisioned to be wealthier farmers. They don't necessarily have more money than others, but they're kind of projected to be that way. These kulaks have their tools and horses confiscated. Many are exiled internally, sent to poor quality lands in Siberia, or other places like we'll talk about in the next episode, like Magnitogorsk. In 1930, Stalin officially ended the policy of forced collectivization, and overall grain harvest returned to surplus levels. But the damage was done. Over 1.5 million peasants lost their lands during this second round of collectivization. Over 500,000 of them were deported internally. And while estimates tend to vary, scholars are pretty certain that millions of people starved to death during the process of collectivization, not only in the Ukraine, as we'll talk about more specifically in a moment, but also in areas of Central Asia like Kazakhstan. One of the larger developments that happens in 1932, 33, 34 is that as you're having this grain crisis, Stalin interprets it not just as, okay, we're not getting enough grain, we're struggling again with the countryside, we have to win over the peasantry. He sees also elements of nationalism that could complicate the Soviet project. He sees, and this is something that we're probably more familiar with or aware of now given the current state of Eastern Europe today, he sees a potential fifth column in Ukrainian nationalism. The idea that Ukrainians are not 100% loyal to the Soviet Union, that they may have these crazy ideas about independence, about being a separate nation. They don't just think about themselves as being, kind of brother Slavs or the little Slavs to the great Russians that are dominating the Soviet Union. And so Stalin will use this situation of famine, of collectivization, to try to punish Ukrainians in particular. In 1932, for example, Soviet authorities began increasing the amount of grain that they take from specifically Ukraine. They moved from taking about a third of all grain production to about 50% of it, which on the surface, maybe that doesn't sound like that much. Oh, what's 17% more grain? Not that big a deal, right? But when the farmers need that grain, not just to survive to eat, but they also need grain to plant in the future so that they don't all die of starvation, now it becomes cataclysmic. When, as you might imagine, local Ukrainian farmers are somewhat resistant to this, they don't like the idea that, okay, you're going to take more of my grain. How am I going to survive? I'm going to keep more of it. I'm going to hide more of it, or I may not be able to even produce this grain in the first place. The reaction of Stalin is to say, this is sabotage. This is Ukrainians appealing to their nationalism, thinking about themselves. They are the ones that are to blame here, not me. I need to force them to become fully on board or destroy them in the process. And so those Soviet agents operating in Ukraine become ruthless. They become brutal. They take all of the grain. They leave no food for peasants in some villages. And so we start to go from a grain shortage and people starving to actual widespread famine. You can find online pictures of cannibals from this period because so many people are dying. You can find pictures of people walking down streets and there's just bodies laying everywhere because they just starved to death and there's not much that you can do about it. In fact, there's so much famine that you don't even have the energy to start to bury the dead. We're talking here about somewhere between 5 and 6 million people dying in the Ukraine from this kind of intentional starvation. As this process plays out, there is no official recognition from the Soviet government that the starvation is occurring. It's forbidden to talk about it. This is one of the things that got Ryutin in trouble, right? This is the kind of event that creates the crisis that then leads to the Great Purges, because Ryutin is talking about what's going on in the Ukraine and the famine and saying, this is not a good thing. We need to stop this. Even after Stalin dies, it is forbidden in the Soviet Union to talk about this mass starvation. Basically until the fall of the Soviet Union, when you have an independent Ukraine, and there are still living memories of this, and people start to say, okay, we need to talk openly about this. We need to acknowledge what happened here. So this event in Ukrainian history is known as the Holodomor. And it is maybe not 100% mathematically equivalent to the Holocaust, but it is pretty darn close to it. And for Ukrainians, it has that same sort of meaning that the Holocaust has for Jews today. Right? This is a moment of national suffering. This is a moment of national tragedy. And for many Ukrainians today, it's a moment that they say, we are not really brothers with the Russians. Right? If you get into the current war in Ukraine, you say, okay, why don't the Ukrainians just surrender? Why don't they just agree to a deal? A big part of it is the living memory of the Holodomor, of millions of their citizens dying and now blaming basically the Russians for it. So the Holodomor is a really big deal. And I should say, too, before I went to Ukraine in 2013, and they had a museum they just opened about the Holodomor, and it was really fascinating. I got to talk to the director there. And one of the things she told me was when they had a sort of Russian-leaning or pro-Russian president, they cut all the funding for this museum, and wasn't sure if it would survive, and everybody, okay, we're not going to talk about the Holodomor anymore. When they had a pro-Western politician that was in charge, all of a sudden the funding gates were open, everybody talked about it, and people wanted to know about it. So this question of the Holodomor, especially in Ukrainian memory today, is critically important, very, very tragic, and is, again, on that level, morally speaking, with the Holocaust, one could argue. Okay, so far we've seen a number of ways that Soviet life under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s was perhaps even worse than life in the 19-teens and 20s under Lenin. By the late 1920s, the Bolshevik idea of democratic centralism had essentially been replaced with a personal dictatorship led by Stalin. When the Politburo showed signs of autonomous thought in the early 1930s, Stalin responded with a series of massive purges designed to teach members of the Communist Party that support for their leader was not enough, that obedience was the prime virtue. To emphasize this, violence was used to keep party members vigilant, always in search of deviations and enemies that required or justified political repression. In the end, large numbers of Communist Party members were arrested, shot, or exiled, including those who had orchestrated the violence in the first place. At the same time, the drive towards industrialization began in 1929, once again opened the prospect of class war in the countryside, which, as we have seen, with devastating effects. Famine raged across the Soviet landscape, with Soviet Ukraine suffering, in particular, what some historians have argued is a Holocaust-equivalent genocide. Given these conditions, it is not hard to understand the appeal of fascism in other parts of Europe, such as Italy or Germany, during this period. But that is a story for another day. For now, let's focus on the more pressing question for Soviet history, which is how anyone could have tolerated or even supported living in such a nightmarish system, where the idea of hundreds of thousands of deaths could be seen as acceptable. Whereas the expression of the time went, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Why did people support Stalin? This is the question that we'll try to answer in our next episode. Okay, so that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you again for listening. If you'd like to read more about life in Stalin's Soviet Union, you can find references and recommendations on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also read more about upcoming and past episodes, including some of our special edition podcasts on topics like the war in Ukraine, Queen Elizabeth II, or the history of Christmas. But that's all for now. Join us next time, dear listeners, as we take history off the page.